Nobody could have predicted that when two security guards attempted to relocate a black Marine from his son's graduation ceremony, 6 Navy SEALs would silently rise from the crowd and stop the entire confrontation without speaking a word. Solomon Dryden never expected anyone to notice him when he parked behind Elmridge High School. The structure looked typical of smaller Texas town schools. Weathered red brick, flags waving over the main entrance, teenagers clustered near the gym entrance. The area was already busy. Parents dressed formally, siblings holding celebratory signs, an elderly woman supported by a walker. All the usual elements were there. He parked his Dodge Charger against the chain-link fence and stepped out, straightening his deep blue Marine uniform. His boots reflected like glass, not from showing off, but from ingrained habits. His upright posture immediately set him apart. His face, while calm, carried the stillness of someone who had observed life from many angles. He had driven 8 hours from Temple to witness his son's high school graduation. He could have flown, but the Charger was his late wife's preferred vehicle, and even 2 years after her death, he felt her presence most strongly on the road. Solomon retrieved a worn photograph from the glove compartment. His wife holding baby Turin, slightly torn at the corner. He tucked it inside his jacket pocket. "I gave you my word," he whispered. "I wouldn't miss this moment." His walk to the entrance was deliberate and meaningful. His chest swelled with an emotion he couldn't name, existing somewhere between pride and longing. The gymnasium was packed with metal chairs covering the floor and overflowing bleachers. The air carried hints of popcorn, concessions, and floor polish, noisy, chaotic, but alive. Solomon presented his printed ticket to a volunteer at the entrance, a small man with a clipboard and headset. The man examined it quickly, nodded, and directed him toward the 3rd row on the left. "Family seating up front," he said. "Much appreciated," Solomon responded steadily. Making his way to the designated row, he noticed other families as he passed. Some people glanced at him, did double takes at his uniform, then looked away as if they hadn't seen anything. One woman offered a small smile before whispering to her companion. Solomon didn't react. He had been black, tall, and uniformed for a long time. He understood what different looks meant. He found his seat and sat down in the slightly unstable plastic chair, adjusting it without complaint. Before him, the stage was prepared with banners declaring Class of 2024 in large silver letters. School board members stood near the podium, reviewing their notes. Solomon scanned the rows of students lined up at the gym's far end. Turin stood somewhere in the middle, tall, lanky, with his mother's eyes. 18 years had passed so quickly. He remembered holding him the night he was born, still in uniform with dirt under his fingernails, having flown in from Okinawa with only 4 days leave. And here they were now. He sat motionless, absorbing every detail of the moment. Behind him, people continued arriving. Chairs scraped, programs rustled, someone laughed loudly, a man dropped his coffee and muttered complaints. None of it affected Solomon. His world had narrowed to the stage, the rows of young faces, and the weight of the photograph against his chest. When Pomp and Circumstance began playing, the crowd rose to their feet. Some students appeared nervous while others beamed with joy. Solomon stood as well, shoulders squared, arms at his sides. The national anthem followed, with everyone placing hands over hearts. Solomon remained still. He didn't need the gesture. His entire presence served as a salute. He thought of his wife again, how she would have cried throughout the entire ceremony, how she would have adjusted Turin's tie multiple times before letting him leave home. His gaze stayed forward. But as the anthem's final note faded, 2 uniformed men began approaching down the side aisle, heading directly toward him. The security guards moved purposefully. They weren't police officers. Their badges read, Harlan Security Services, wearing standard black polo shirts tucked into cargo pants, with earpieces and radios on their belts. Neither appeared older than 31. One was short and broad-shouldered with a shaved head and stern expression. The other was taller, lanky, and chewing gum like he had better places to be. Solomon noticed them immediately but didn't flinch. His training had taught him long ago that stillness often commanded more respect than movement. He kept his eyes forward, hands resting loosely on his thighs. The shorter guard stopped beside him and leaned down to speak quietly. "Excuse me, sir, we need you to come with us." Solomon slowly turned his head. "Is there an issue?" The taller one stepped forward. "This section is reserved for families of graduating seniors." Solomon calmly reached into his coat and produced the same printed ticket he'd shown at the door. "This is my assigned seat, 3rd row, left side. Family seating confirmed." The shorter guard didn't even glance at the ticket. "We were told it's full." Solomon didn't move. "It was full when I sat down too." "Who gave you that instruction?" The tall guard shifted uncomfortably, not expecting such a calm, clear voice. "Look, it's not a big deal. There are available seats in the back. Let's not make this complicated." Solomon's eyes narrowed slightly. Not with anger, just quiet assessment. "I drove 8 hours to watch my son cross that stage. I'll be remaining right here." A few heads began turning. A woman 2 rows over nudged her husband and gestured toward them. Someone in the bleachers tilted their phone slightly, possibly recording. The short guard straightened and looked around. "Sir, I'm going to ask one more time." "You can ask all day," Solomon said, his voice lower now, firmer. "I'm not moving." The tall one made a disapproving sound. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back. That's all we're suggesting." And there it was. Solomon looked at him fully now. That phrase wasn't about logistics or policy. It was about something older, something quieter, something that had followed him throughout his life in boardrooms, waiting areas, front porches, and even the base cafeteria. A whispered threat beneath politeness. He didn't respond. The atmosphere shifted around them the way it does when people sense a line has been crossed. The short guard noticed it too, adjusting the radio on his hip and muttering something into the microphone while maintaining eye contact. Solomon remained seated, staring forward as if the conversation had ended. Because for him, it had. A woman beside him, older and pale-skinned, leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "Don't let them move you." He nodded once, acknowledging her but saying nothing. He didn't want to create a scene. He wanted to watch his son graduate like any other father, but the guards weren't finished. The tall one lowered his voice again. "Look, if you have a problem, take it up with the school office. We have our orders." Solomon turned toward him once more. "What's your name, son?" The guard blinked. "It's Officer Malley. Your private security," Solomon replied. The other one intervened. "All right, that's enough. If you don't stand up." He didn't complete the sentence because that's when the gym door at the far end clicked open and 6 men entered. No uniforms, no badges, just firm postures, squared shoulders, and faces that suggested they'd endured worse situations than awkward stares and misguided orders. They didn't enter together. They filtered in individually, taking different positions as if they weren't connected. But anyone observing closely could tell they moved similarly, watched the room similarly, sat similarly, still, steady, and alert. Solomon didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly who they were, but the guards didn't, at least not yet, and they were about to discover. Solomon maintained his focus on the stage. His jaw didn't move, but his mind was working. He wasn't angry, not yet, but something inside him engaged like a switch he only used when necessary. The one built for survival, balance, and patience under pressure. The 2 guards didn't leave. They lingered. It was the kind of lingering that wasn't about performing a job. It was about reminding someone they held power. But what they didn't understand was that Solomon had lived in places where power meant life or death, not some gymnasium with folding chairs and a sound system. A student's name was called from the stage, and the crowd applauded politely, but people weren't really focusing on the ceremony anymore. At least not those nearby. They were watching the standoff, pretending not to. The taller guard, Malley, shifted his stance again, leaning closer with a quieter voice. "I'm trying to help you here, all right? This doesn't need to become ugly." Solomon's eyes flicked to him. You don't possess that kind of help to offer. Pause. Mally drew back slightly as if reconsidering his next move. But the shorter one, Garvin according to his badge, was less diplomatic. He didn't appreciate being challenged. His hand hovered near the radio again. A few rows behind, a man stood up slowly. Nobody noticed initially. He didn't speak, just crossed his arms and stared. Clean-shaven, broad frame, sharp eyes. He took a seat near the aisle without removing his gaze from the scene. In front of him, a second man stood up on the gymnasium's opposite side. Same posture, calm, intentional. Then a third. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Solomon knew them all. He didn't turn to look because his instincts didn't require confirmation. He had led these men through mud, gunfire, and darkness deeper than most people could imagine. Garvin leaned down again, this time with something new in his voice. Listen, man, you're turning this into a situation. Solomon turned his head slowly and deliberately. And you're not listening. Garvin's hand twitched toward the radio again, but before he could speak, a voice broke the tension from 10 feet away. Is there a reason this man is being bothered? It was clear, calm, controlled, the kind of voice that doesn't rise to get attention but drops just enough to make everyone else stop talking. It came from a man standing in the center aisle, tall, salt and pepper beard, fitted black coat over a gray shirt. His name was Creed Marston. He was the one Solomon had pulled from wreckage in Kandahar, dragging him across 200 yards of sand while bullets rained down like gravel. Garvin looked up, caught off guard. Who are you? Creed didn't answer. He stepped forward. I asked you a question. Mally raised a hand. Sir, we have this under control. No, Creed said, sharper now. You don't. Another man stood up from the far bleachers. Then another. 4 of them now. Solomon remained seated, still quiet. The entire left side of the gymnasium was now watching openly. A boy pointed. A teacher tried to redirect attention back to the stage, but nobody was looking at the diplomas anymore. Creed took one more step forward. You're embarrassing yourselves, and you're one breath away from making this worse. Garvin glanced at Mally, who looked less confident by the second. It was clear they hadn't expected backup, especially not backup like this. I don't care what your orders were, Creed said. You don't put your hands on that man. You don't tell him to move. You don't ask again. The silence in the gymnasium felt tight, the kind that didn't come from fear but respect, a quiet respect that began to swell as more people realized what was happening. Solomon finally looked up at Creed and gave the smallest nod. Not a thank you, not a request, just recognition. Creed's eyes softened for a moment. Then he stepped back and took his seat again, arms folded. But the tension hadn't left the air. Not yet. And the people watching were waiting to see what the guards would do next. The gymnasium, the stage, the banners, the faces all blurred into the background of Solomon's mind. His eyes remained open, but his memory pulled him backward 15 years to Afghanistan. It was late afternoon in Kandahar province. The sun didn't set gently there. It crashed down like a hammer, turning the sand to rust and the air to steel. Solomon, a gunnery sergeant then, had just finished briefing his unit when everything went wrong. A roadside IED exploded under their convoy, flipping the lead Humvee like a toy. Dirt and metal rained down before anyone could scream. Then came the gunfire. Not scattered, but coordinated. Solomon didn't think. He moved. He ducked behind what remained of a door frame, surveying the chaos. Smoke clouded the valley's edge, but he saw 6 men down, trapped behind the burning wreckage of a second vehicle. Most were pinned. One was already trying to crawl forward, dragging another by the vest. That was Creed Marston. He had just 3 months in country and a bullet through his thigh. Solomon bolted without hesitation. No radio call. He ran through open ground, dodging bursts of gunfire, sliding into cover behind a blown axle. Creed looked up, blood on his temple, gasping. You're bleeding, Solomon had said. You noticed? Creed coughed. Solomon grabbed the straps of the downed soldier beside him, Enrique Soto, and began pulling. Creed pushed from behind, wincing with every inch. "Where's Divas?" Solomon shouted. Creed pointed weakly. "Left side, under the hood." That's when Solomon saw him. A young SEAL pinned under part of the engine block, leg trapped. He was calling for help but too far gone to move. Without pausing, Solomon told Creed, "You keep low and move when I move." Creed nodded. That's when he truly understood what leadership looked like. Solomon sprinted across again. His foot hit gravel, then bone, but he didn't stop. He slid to Divas, crouched low, and gripped the edge of the mangled hood with both hands. It wouldn't budge. "Gunny, don't," Divas shouted. "I'm good. You're not staying here." Solomon braced one foot, dug deep, and lifted. His shoulders strained, his ribs ached, the metal groaned, but it rose just enough for Divas to yank his leg free. They fell back together, crawling toward the ridgeline. Gunfire cracked overhead. Creed returned with Soto, limping on his good leg. Two others followed, Lim and Horton, faces blackened with ash, rifles ready. When the firing stopped, there were no cheers, no victory speech, just silence and breathing. All 6 of them were alive. Solomon was the last to check out. He stayed on rear watch until the dust settled and the medevac arrived. He didn't speak for a long time after that, but Creed remembered they all did. After that day, there was never a doubt. If Solomon asked for anything, anywhere, anytime, they'd be there, no matter what. Back in the gymnasium, Creed sat quietly in his chair, eyes fixed on the guards still standing near Solomon. He wasn't thinking about war, he was thinking about promises. The man who had dragged him out of a war zone was now being harassed in front of a high school stage for trying to watch his son graduate. He clenched his fists. Another SEAL, Javier Meeks, walked in and sat 4 rows back. Then Zachary Wells found a spot along the right side bleachers. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Solomon glanced toward the back of the gymnasium, just briefly, his eyes meeting Meeks. That was enough. But the guards didn't understand what those looks meant. Not yet. And the moment they made the next move, they'd learn quickly. The ceremony continued, at least on the surface. Names were still being called. Families clapped, some too loudly, trying to cover the tension that now thickened the air. But attention had shifted. Eyes that had once been glued to the stage now kept drifting toward the 3rd row on the left, where Solomon Dryden sat like a statue and 2 guards stood like they didn't know what to do next. Garvin glanced toward the front, where a school official tried to get his attention. The woman looked nervous, mouthing something and gesturing subtly toward the guards. But Garvin shook his head. He wasn't ready to walk away. He'd started something, and his ego didn't know how to back down. Mally shifted his weight again, his jaw working harder on the gum. Clearly uncomfortable, but he hadn't walked away either. "Sir," Garvin said again, this time louder. "This is your final warning." Solomon didn't move. To do what, exactly? Garvin stepped forward, leaning so close his belt brushed Solomon's knee. "Stop making a scene. We don't want any trouble, just move to the back." Solomon turned his head and looked him directly in the eye. "You're the only one causing trouble." Garvin's nostrils flared. That's when it slipped out. "You think wearing that uniform makes you better than everybody else? This is a high school, man, not your base." A hush fell across the surrounding rows. A little girl stopped squirming in her seat. A dad with a camera froze mid-zoom. Even Mally took a half step back, as if the words had landed heavier than expected. Solomon didn't blink. He took a breath, not to calm himself but to stay grounded. "You need to walk away." Garvin didn't. Instead, his hand dropped to the front of his belt, not on a weapon but near enough to feel threatening. And that's when Creed stood up. He didn't yell, he didn't posture. He just stepped into the aisle, slow and focused, as if the conversation had become his business now. The gymnasium wasn't dead silent, but close. Creed's voice was clear. "If you touch him, you'll answer to me." Garvin turned his head. "And who the hell are you?" Creed took another step forward. "The man who's telling you this ends right now." One of the school board members noticed what was happening and whispered something to the principal. An assistant principal got up and started moving toward the back of the gymnasium, probably calling someone on the walkie clipped to her side. The school staff was finally realizing this wasn't going to die down quietly. More SEALs rose from their seats, spread across the room. No formation, no spoken cue, just a unified instinct that kicked in all at once. By now, all 6 were standing. Garvin looked around, realizing they weren't just dealing with some angry parent. Something was different. These men didn't fidget, they didn't shift from foot to foot. Their presence filled the space like pressure before a storm. Creed took a step closer. You have 2 choices. Walk away now or watch this go somewhere you don't want it to go. Mally's voice finally cracked through. Let's just back off, man. But Garvin still hesitated. Solomon spoke again, not to Garvin but to Creed. Don't waste your breath. He already made his decision. Creed didn't smile, he just lowered his voice one last time. Don't mistake silence for weakness. Finally, Garvin stepped back. Not much, but enough. His hand dropped away from his belt. His face burned, but he was outnumbered and outclassed. The principal appeared near the aisle, whispering quickly to the guards. Whatever she said was quiet but firm enough to send them both walking toward the back exit. They didn't look at anyone on their way out. Solomon exhaled slowly and steadily. Creed sat back down without a word. All 6 SEALs remained standing, but the moment still hung in the air. And Turin Dryden was watching everything from the lineup of students. His hands clenched at his sides. Turin Dryden stood near the center of the graduating class, positioned between a girl with bright braids and a boy whose gown kept slipping off his shoulders. They were trying to focus on the ceremony, laughing nervously and checking their name cards as if the world was normal, but Turin's world wasn't. He had seen the 2 guards walking toward his father from the minute the anthem ended. First, he thought maybe it was routine, maybe they were helping someone find a seat. But something in his chest told him otherwise. Then he saw the way his dad sat so still, so composed, but locked in. He'd seen that look before, the same one he'd caught when he was 12 and came home crying because someone at school had said something they shouldn't have. His dad didn't raise his voice then either. He just sat with that same expression, like steel that refused to bend. Turin kept his eyes on the scene as best he could from his place in line. He couldn't hear what was said, but the body language told him enough. He saw the guards standing too close, saw his father calmly staying seated, and then he saw a man stand up, a tall guy in a dark coat, and somehow Turin knew that wasn't just a parent. That man knew his father, the way he moved, the way he placed himself between the guard and the row. It was clear he wasn't there for drama, he was there for Solomon Dryden. Then another man stood, and another. It wasn't loud, but it was like the temperature in the room shifted. Everyone was watching now. Turin's heart beat faster. He wasn't scared. He was something else, torn between pride and fire. He had grown up hearing pieces of his dad's service stories, not the gory parts. His dad kept most of those to himself, but bits here and there. A buddy who sent Christmas cards every year, a scar that came from somewhere out in the dust, a box in the garage marked Kandahar that nobody ever opened. He never knew the names, never saw the faces, but now they were here, standing like they'd been waiting for this moment, like they'd never stopped having his dad's back. Turin blinked hard, pushing down the burn behind his eyes. He didn't want to cry, not here, not now. The line moved forward. A few names were called. The clapping picked back up slowly, like someone had hit play again after a pause. But the room wasn't the same anymore. The energy had shifted. It wasn't about balloons or banners. Now it was about respect. One of the assistant principals tapped Turin's shoulder and said something he didn't hear. He just nodded. The student next to him leaned over and whispered, "That's your dad, Turin." He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The entire gymnasium had seen it, and now everyone in that building understood what kind of man Solomon Dryden was. In the audience, Creed remained standing. He didn't look around for approval. He wasn't scanning for attention. He was watching Solomon, still seated in the same plastic chair, hands resting on his lap, eyes locked on the stage like nothing had happened. But something had. The rest of the seals stayed on their feet too, not posturing, just present. Their silence spoke louder than any microphone ever could. A few parents clapped louder now with each name, almost as if they were trying to make up for the tension earlier. The gymnasium had become a living thing, stirred awake by a moment of injustice, held steady by the weight of honor. Solomon remained still, not defiant, not bitter, just present. A father watching his son take one more step into adulthood. But the moment that would break through all of it was still coming, and when Turin's name was finally called, the room wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. The line was moving faster now. Some students were still fidgeting, adjusting caps, whispering jokes under their breath, trying to enjoy the moment. But Turin wasn't in that space anymore. His mind kept flashing back to his father sitting alone, surrounded by faces, but completely centered in that chair like it had been built just for him. There was something about how he held himself, calm, quiet, unshakable, and something about the way those men, those warriors, rose around him without needing to be asked. Turin realized for the first time that he didn't really know the full weight his father carried. Sure, he'd seen the pictures, the medals in the old wooden box, the folded flag tucked into the bookshelf in the living room, but those things never really spoke. They just sat there like relics. Today they walked, today they stood. The assistant principal called out the next name, then another. Turin was 3 people away from the stage. He wiped his palms on his gown, trying to slow his breath. The girl in front of him turned and grinned nervously. "You ready?" Turin smiled a little more than usual. He stepped forward. On the other side of the gymnasium, Solomon leaned slightly forward. His eyes never left the stage. He didn't clap for every student, not out of disrespect, but because his focus had narrowed to the boy in the black robe with the red and white honor cords. The boy who looked so much like his mother when he smiled. 1 name, 2 names, then the announcer paused for a second, cleared her throat, and spoke with a bit more weight than before. Turin Dryden. The name echoed. There was a beat of silence, half a second, maybe less, before the room erupted in clapping, whistling, cheering. But what stood out wasn't the volume, it was the rhythm of it. The sound wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate, coordinated, deep. The 6 seals still standing raised their hands and applauded in perfect unison. Each one clapped with force, not for performance, but as a salute without the salute. A gesture that said, "We see you. We see your father. We honor both." Turin walked across the stage slowly, chin high, steps steady. His heart pounded, but it wasn't nerves, it was pride. And not just pride in himself. It was the pride of knowing exactly who his father was and what it meant to carry that last name. He took his diploma from the principal, shook her hand, and turned toward the audience. His eyes scanned for one person and found him. Solomon didn't wave, didn't stand. He just met his son's eyes and gave the smallest, most meaningful smile of the day. Turin nodded once and stepped off the stage. The applause still hadn't died down. Parents who hadn't said a word all ceremony were now clapping hard. Some stood. A few wiped their eyes, not sure exactly why, but feeling like they just witnessed something that mattered. Solomon sat back in his chair and let the moment wash over him. He wasn't the kind of man to cry in public, but inside, something loosened. Not grief, not pain, just release, the kind that only comes when the circle feels complete, even if it never really is. The other names continued, but something had shifted. From that moment on, every student who walked the stage walked in the echo of what had just happened. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was viral, but because it was real. But the story didn't end with the applause. When father and son met again outside the gymnasium, it would be more than just a proud hug. It would be the passing of something deeper. The final name was called 20 minutes later. Everyone stood as the graduating class threw their caps, screamed with relief, and hugged like they hadn't seen each other in years. Phones went up, cameras clicked, and balloons bobbed above the crowd as the students began filing out through the gymnasium's double doors toward the backlot. Solomon didn't move right away. He sat quietly as the noise swelled around him, soaking it all in. The music, the laughter, the flash of silver and red gowns sweeping by. His eyes followed Turin as he disappeared into the crowd with his classmates. A teacher gave him a high five. Another pulled him in for a side hug. But even with all the chaos, Turin turned once, just once, and looked back. Solomon caught it, a brief glance, but it held everything. "Did you see me?" Solomon's expression gave the answer. Every second. The crowd began to thin. People shuffled out with flowers and balloons, congratulating each other in loud bursts. Solomon stood slowly, stretching his legs, feeling the weight of sitting in one position for too long. Creed walked over as the gymnasium emptied. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Solomon, then toward the exit. "You okay?" Creed finally asked. Solomon nodded. "I've been through worse." Creed smiled slightly. "Yeah, but it still shouldn't have happened." "No," Solomon said, "it shouldn't have." Another SEAL, Javier Meeks, joined them. "We tried to stay low-key, but once that guy put his hand near his belt." Solomon raised a hand gently. "You all did what needed to be done. That was enough." The three men stood there for a few seconds longer, letting the noise drain from the room. Then Solomon said, "I want to see my boy." Outside, the sun was fierce against the concrete, casting long shadows from the bleachers onto the back lot. Students were scattered in small clusters, posing for photos, throwing their caps again, calling out to relatives. Turin stood near the flagpole, his gown half unzipped, the diploma folder in one hand and his phone in the other. When he saw his father approach, he stopped mid-conversation. The crowd around him faded into the background. They met halfway. Turin was the first to speak. "You okay?" Solomon nodded. "You?" "Yeah," Turin said, then looked down for a second. "They tried to move you." "I know." Turin's jaw flexed. "I was ready to walk off that stage, Dad. I swear I was 2 seconds from saying something." Solomon placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "And that's why you didn't." Turin looked up. "What do you mean?" "Because you knew I could handle it, and because you handled your moment like a man. You didn't let anybody take it from you." Turin held his breath for a second. "Who were those guys that stood up?" Solomon glanced behind him. The 6 SEALs were now outside too, gathered near the exit, talking quietly. They weren't looking for attention, just keeping an eye out like always. "They're men I bled with. Men who know what loyalty means," Solomon said. "Men who don't forget." Turin nodded slowly. "That was powerful." "It was necessary," Solomon replied. "Sometimes silence is louder than shouting, and sometimes standing up without speaking says more than 1,000 words." For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Turin smiled. "You gonna tell me those were stories now?" Solomon chuckled. "Some of them. You're old enough for the real parts now." They stood there shoulder to shoulder. Not just father and son, but 2 men connected by something that couldn't be explained, only lived. Across the lot, Creed raised a hand. Not a wave, just a gesture of respect. Turin returned it without hesitation. The sun kept climbing, but for them, the Dryden men, time moved differently now. But one more moment remained, because after all that, the real lesson hadn't yet been spoken aloud. Most of the crowd had cleared by the time Solomon and Turin walked back to the parking lot. A few families still lingered, laughing around folding chairs or loading up trunks with flower arrangements and graduation gifts. But the buzz had quieted, and the sun had softened into early evening light. Solomon unlocked the charger, the same one his wife used to drive to parent-teacher meetings and weekend road trips. Turin paused at the passenger door, running his fingers along a scratch near the handle. "She would have been screaming the loudest today," he said softly. "She would have made you retake every photo until your smile looked just right." Solomon replied, managing a grin. They climbed in, shutting the doors behind them. The car was warm from the sun, but it felt like a cocoon sealed off from the rest of the world. For a few breaths, they sat in silence. Then Turin turned to face his father. "I gotta ask, why didn't you say anything to those guards? You just sat there." Solomon tapped the steering wheel once, then turned to him. "Because I don't have to stand up for who I am, and I don't need to raise my voice to be heard." Turin looked out the window for a second, chewing on that. "You know how many times in my life I've had to choose between letting something slide or blowing it up?" Solomon continued. "That moment today, what those men tried to do, it wasn't new. But how we respond, that's what defines us." "But they disrespected you," Turin said, "in front of everybody." "Yes," Solomon said, "and everyone saw it. But they also saw the truth. They saw 6 men who had every reason to be somewhere else stand up, not because I asked, but because they knew what that moment meant." Turin sat with that. "Son," Solomon said, "life will hand you 100 chances to react with anger, and sometimes anger is justified. But most times, silence cuts deeper, dignity sticks longer. That's what people remember." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded photo, the one of Turin as a baby, his late wife cradling him. "I carried this with me through Kandahar. I carried it through losing your mom, and I carried it here today, not because it gives me strength, but because it reminds me of what's worth protecting." Turin's voice dropped. "You always knew who had your back." Solomon smiled. "I didn't need to know. I just had faith. Real men don't vanish when things get uncomfortable. They show up and they stand." There was a pause before Turin spoke again. "I want to be like that, like you." "You already are," Solomon said. "You walked that stage with pride. You didn't let anger steal your moment. You stayed grounded even when everything around you was trying to throw you off balance." Outside the car, the last of the SEALs were getting into their vehicles. Creed gave one last look toward the Charger before driving off. Solomon nodded once. No words, just the quiet acknowledgement of something permanent. Turin leaned back in the seat. "So, what now?" Solomon turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life. "Now we drive home. You get to choose dinner." Turin grinned. "Waffle House." Solomon chuckled. "Of course." As they pulled out of the lot, the school faded behind them, but the memory of what happened inside that gymnasium wouldn't fade anytime soon for anyone who was there. For Turin, that day would mark something far greater than a diploma. It was the day he realized manhood had nothing to do with noise and everything to do with how you carry yourself when the world stops watching. Some people shout to be seen, others just sit in silence and are never forgotten. The Charger rolled down the quiet Texas road, father and son heading home with a new understanding between them. In the rearview mirror, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, like a salute to the day that had changed them both. Solomon glanced at his son, who was staring out the window with a thoughtful expression. The young man who had walked across that stage was different from the boy who had lined up with his classmates just hours before. Not older in years, but deeper in understanding. "Dad," Turin said quietly. "Yeah, thank you for showing me what strength really looks like." Solomon's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "You don't need to thank me for being your father." "I'm not thanking you for being my father," Turin replied. "I'm thanking you for being the man you are." The road stretched ahead of them, and for the first time in a long while, Solomon felt his wife's presence not as an absence, but as a warmth. She would have been proud of them both today, of the man who refused to be moved and the young man who learned what it meant to stand without standing up. As they drove toward their new chapter together, the echoes of that gymnasium moment would follow them, not as a burden, but as a reminder that dignity, respect, and brotherhood are not just words, but ways of living that can change a room, a moment, and a life. The story of Solomon Dryden and his son would be told again, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was necessary. In a world that often mistakes volume for strength and aggression for power, they had shown that true authority comes from within, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to move. And in the years to come, When Turin faced his own moments of testing, he would remember not just his father's stillness in that plastic chair, but the quiet army of men who rose around him. Proof that honor recognizes honor, and that some bonds forged in fire never break, even in the peaceful quiet of a high school graduation. That's the kind of legacy that lasts. Not in monuments or medals, but in the way a man teaches his son to stand, and in the brotherhood that stands with them both when it matters most. When it matters most. When it matters most. When it matters most.